Good afternoon. I'm Sr Pam Biehl, and Father Nathan Linton is here with me this afternoon. Father Nathan is a Capuchin Franciscan priest currently living in Milwaukee and also the Vocation Director for the Midwest Province. Father Nathan is here with me today to talk about how he became a Capuchin Franciscan, as well as what his ministry involves as a vocation director for his religious community. So welcome, Father Nathan, and we're excited to hear your story today. So before we talk about your life with the Capuchin Franciscans, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, what your family life was like, and then how you started to think about becoming a priest?
Absolutely. And actually, a lot of that is tied together. So
Okay.
my family, I grew up in Wisconsin, kind of originally on the East Coast, and then we moved west to Cumberland, where I really grew up.
Okay.
And I fairly typical Midwest family, but I think I had great examples of service in both of my parents. My father, throughout most of my life, was actually the chief of police.
Oh,
And he was in Cumberland for many, many years. So certainly, in a position of service for the community. And I grew up with my mom working as a caregiver, working often with adults with developmental disabilities, but now working actually in almost like a halfway house. So my parents both very much in these beautiful ministries, jobs of service to those around them. Very typical childhood, growing up, small town Wisconsin, very much just spending time hanging out with friends. I was involved in sports, but we were certainly a very faithful family. My mom is a cradle Catholic, the 13th of 14 kids. And my father is a convert to the faith. So he was raised in a Southern denomination called the Church of Christ and became Catholic after my parents married. Um, and so my father has always been a very influential figure in my life. I should say I also have one brother, an older brother, Aaron, who's now married and has two kids. But my father was always a very influential in my life and kind of grew up looking up to him. And when I was I think it was the end of seventh grade, maybe the summer between seventh and eighth grade, my father announced to our family that he was thinking about becoming a permanent deacon. And so it was really seeing my father going through his own process of discernment that jump-started my own. Uh, if God's calling him to something, does that mean God's calling me to something? And so as I kind of grew up in the midst of high school, still involved in all sorts of different activities, sports, forensics, like a peer support group that our school offered, all sorts of different things. I was also really being intentional about growing in my own life of faith. And I've always been more bookish. So first, when those questions started to arise and the idea of priesthood would come up, well, initially I wasn't very attracted to that. Just most of the priests I had met were older, and I really had to ask, well, do people still even do this? Um, but the idea kept coming up and said, all right, I have to at least investigate. So I started to do research and learn more about what priesthood is and what a priest does and what that life is like. But I think almost more importantly, I started to investigate the faith. So my vocation story and my discernment really goes hand in hand with me taking the faith on for myself. Um, and the more and more I learned about the faith, and I think more importantly, the more I learned what we believe and why we believe it as Catholics, the more I could see the beauty of our faith, and the more I could imagine giving my life to that.
oh,
So I started to discern with the diocese actually in Superior, Wisconsin. Religious life was not something on my mind. I had never met a friar, never met a monk, so it was the furthest thing from my mind. Started to discern with the diocese, did a visit with them to the local college seminary in St. Paul. I was very impressed by what I saw and very relieved, that these men who I encountered were normal people. Um, we could have our moments of prayer, a holy hour, liturgy of the hours, Eucharist, but then we could go out and play ultimate, right?
ah,
Ultimate,
true.
ultimate frisbee. We were normal human beings. And so I felt comfortable about the idea of at least moving on to seminary after high school. It was when I was a junior in high school, at the very end of the year, our guidance counselor came into our class and assigned us a paper about the career we were planning on going into. And we had to write about a backup career that was similar, but not too similar. And I said, well, what on earth am I supposed to write about? What's similar to priesthood? And I ended up writing about religious life.
Okay.
And what struck me was the vow of poverty. As I looked at a few different orders, that idea of really leaving everything behind, so to speak, of giving everything, of not having anything to tie me down so that I would be completely free to respond, was very attractive. And so I started to look more seriously at different religious communities, and the Capuchins' emphasis on simplicity, on poverty and service to the poor was kind of that initial draw to our community. Yeah.
Wow. So as you moved through some study with the Capuchins and then diocesan seminary and back to the Capuchins, as you look at the difference between a diocesan priest and a religious order priest, how would you tell our audience the difference between those two? Both of them obviously ordained men serving God's people, but what would you see as the biggest difference between a diocesan priest and a religious order priest, Father?
So fantastic question. So a diocesan priest is really tied geographically to the church, right?
Good.
So he serves people typically within parish life within a specific region of the country, within a specific diocese. And so he's very much called as a diocesan priest to sacramental service within that region. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. For us as religious priests, however, we may not necessarily be as tied geographically. You know, the province I belong to ranges from Michigan to Montana.
Okay.
But ultimately, our life is tied to a community of brothers and tied to a particular way of life. It's not simply one way of ministry or even one focus of ministry, but really to this way of life and to this brotherhood. So having that in common, that common life together as brothers within our community, having that for us as Capuchins, kind of that contemplative life too, together as brothers, and ministry together as brothers, whether that's sacramental, whether that's service to the poor, whether that's preaching, but living within the context of this Franciscan way of life. That's in some ways a little bit more all-encompassing.
That's a great way to explain the differences. Thank you very much. You are also the Vocation Director as part of all the things that you do. Can you just tell us a little bit about what does a Vocation Director do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my brothers might ask that question as well. But ultimately, my job, and I mean, in one sense, is to promote our way of life and to help the world to come to know who we are. But I really think the heart of my ministry as vocation director is simply to accompany and to walk with young men as they are trying to understand what God is asking of them in their life. And so in some senses, it's has elements of recruitment, though I don't quite like that word applied to vocation directors. But really, in some ways, it's very similar to spiritual direction. You know, you're walking with someone, you're getting to know them, you're getting to understand how God is moving in their life and in their heart, and inviting them to at least experience and explore the way of life that God has called us to as Capuchins and see if that might be a good fit for them. In the end, you know, as a vocations director, my job is not just to get as many men as I possibly can into the Capuchins. I think that's a wrong way of going about this ministry. Certainly to invite and to encourage, sure, but ultimately it's to help them find where they're meant to be in life. And if that's with us, beautiful. If it's with the diocese, praise God. Or a different community, amazing. Or even if that's as a loving husband and father. As long as they're moving towards where they're meant to be, then I'm doing my job.
Oh, that is great. And you're really answering the next question, which is our theme for this year as a Franciscan Sister Christian Charity, a member of what I'm a member of my own community. We are looking at people who are rebuilding Christ Church. And as I listen to you explain what a vocation director does, there's no doubt that you do that. Can you maybe add anything to that, how you see yourself rebuilding Christ Church today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a huge part of rebuilding Christ Church is making sure that there are ministers within the church and that people are being invited into that. But I think in the midst of discernment, in the midst of walking with these young men, in the midst of their own discernment, there's always a call to a deeper relationship with Christ and a deeper awareness of what God is doing in them. And that alone helps to build up men to truly be disciples and to live out the gospel in their own life as they are best going to be able to do so. It's forming young men, and I see a couple of young women as a spiritual director, helping them to understand where God is calling them so that they can also go out and help rebuild the church.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So we pass on all that we have learned to the next person and so on. Thank you. So any last words before we close today, Father, any words for the young people as they may be listening to this interview and discerning their own call, some words of advice you may give them as the vocation director?
So many, sister. I would say one, don't be afraid.
Okay.
Don't be afraid of religious life or of looking at these various vocations the church has to offer. Because ultimately, we're going to be the most deeply satisfied when we're living out the call that is ours. And yes, we might wear clothes that is very distinct from what you see in the world, and our life is very countercultural. I mean, I think it's, in some ways, it's a great challenge to market or advertise or offer poverty, chastity, and obedience, which is so contrary to the life of our society. But we're normal human beings. We're loving human beings. We live together as brothers, as sisters, as family. And our life is one filled with joy. So don't be afraid to explore these ways of life, but always do so in a spirit of prayer. Spend time in silence, listening to the voice of God and the ways that He is moving within your hearts. All discernment takes time. All discernment takes prayer. So give it the time and attention it needs.
Wow, wonderful words of advice. Thank you so much, Father Nathan, for taking the time not only to share your story of God's call, but also to what it means to be a vocation director and those great words of advice for our young people. May you continue to be the face of Jesus to all the young people that you meet in your ministry, and may God fill you with the wisdom and insight you need to walk with others as they discern God's call in their life. And thanks to all of you who took the time to listen to this interview today. If you are someone who is discerning God's call in your life, I hope Father Nathan's words of advice were helpful to you. Do not be afraid and to keep on praying, and that you find mentors in your life who will be able to share their wisdom with you as well. So have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for being part of this interview today.